Okay, you are listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website, www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHMWPPM. Tonight on the program, it's Budget Week. We will be joined by City Budget Director Marissa Waxman, and our own Denise Clay Murray and I will discuss the impending retirement of City Council President Darrell Clark and what that means going on. Denise, how are you tonight?
I'm good. How are you?
How are you?
I'm all right. Computer issues aside, I'm okay. Right before we came on, I had a street against computers in general. I'm still recovering, but I'm okay. So it's good to see you, Denise. But before we get into our discussion about what we think this means for City Council, and before we get into our interview with City Budget Director Marissa Waxman, what I'd like to do briefly is talk a little bit about the city budget and how we kind of get here, and what this is. Budget is something we focus a lot on this program, because honestly, if City Hall is kind of the engine where things happen, the budget is the fuel. Nothing happens without budget, without the money. And so what we're going to do a little bit right now is tell you a little bit about what the 2024 budget season is going to look like. The examples we're going to use are from last year's budget, just to give you an idea of where we are. But these things that we're going to talk about can be applied to this upcoming budget. So what is the city budget? Next slide, please. Okay, there we go. So there are two major components really to the city budget: the operating budget and the capital budget. Now, we could talk also about the school district budget, the airport budget. There's other things that factor into this, but for our purposes here, and what we're really going to be talking about tomorrow and beyond, are the capital budget and the operating budget. So even though they're different things, we should kind of think of them as one, really, for our purposes here. And so let's go on to the next slide, please. The capital budget is more like long-term investments, all right? So we talk about buildings, maintenance, all the things that are going to live beyond this year that need funding. Last year, the capital budget was just shy of $4 billion, $3.84 billion. And over the next 6 years, you're going to see at least $11 billion more putting into that capital budget. All right, next slide, please. So to make a long story short, what is eligible for the capital budget? It usually has to be an item that costs over $15,000 and will live for a while. It's not something that you just do as a one-off kind of expense. There has to be planning and thought put into it. In order to qualify for the capital budget, up to 1% of a capital budget expense is required for art, public art. As a city with a lot of murals and a lot of public art, that kind of makes sense, and I think makes sense not just aesthetically but economically too, because it funds the arts and provides a lot of different things there. We have to also prove that we're preserving unique resources. So something that's cultural, historic, those kinds of things. Basically something that makes a city a better place to live in. Also, we could talk about public buildings that fit that category. And maintains consistency with a facilities renewal cycle. So the useful life of facilities varies from 15 to 20 years for like roofs, for instance, okay? So if that counts as a capital budget expense, we can do that with this money. All right, next slide, please. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the operating budget, and this is probably what's going to get the most attention tomorrow and beyond. The operating budget funds the day-to-day operations of the city. Each city department has its own budget, which must be brought before City Council, and this budget, along with the capital budget, must be passed before the fiscal year begins. In Philadelphia's case, the absolute last day you could pass a budget is June 30th, because it would go into effect July 1st. Okay. Next slide, please. So, oh, I got a little messed up, but that's okay. The operating budget, where does it come from? Where do we get our operating budget funds? Well, the biggest contributor to the operating budget is the wage tax, and that's $1.6 billion. Last year's operating budget, just to give you the scope of it, was about $5.6 billion. All right. So wage tax about $1.6 billion. Real estate tax $780 million. Business tax $611 million. PICA, which is the money we send to the state to pay down bond debt from like 30 years ago, which is almost finished now. I think 1.5% of the wage tax goes to this PICA fund, and then we get the rest back after we pay down the bond debt. So that was $561 million last year. The real estate transfer tax $300 million, sales tax $278 million. There are about 20 taxes altogether in the city of Philadelphia. Not all of them apply to everyone, but those are the biggest. Okay, those are your biggest taxes that contribute to the pie that makes the operating budget. All right, so what do we spend that on? Next slide, please. The biggest thing that we pay for, the biggest category, is the people who work for the city. There's about 30,000 city employees, probably less than that because the city's having a hard time hiring. But our city payroll is about $2 billion. Pensions are about $843 million a year, and benefits for employees is about $761 million. Services that are contracted out, things that the city doesn't do itself but pays others to do, is just over $1 billion. So the 1, 3, and 4 there in those bullet points are all just city employees, and item 2 is what the city employees do not do. So you see that's where a lot of our money goes. But it makes sense, right? Because if you're gonna have a city, you need city services. You need people to do those services. So that's where that money comes in. And if you look at, and this is very hard to see, but maybe we can put this in the newsletter once we get the updated version, how this all breaks down. And you'll notice that the 4 biggest pieces of those pie, like I said, are those 4 things we just mentioned. And that's a lot of it. That's a lot of our city budget where it goes. Next slide, please. So how does this work? How do we get from where we are now to the end of the season? Now, what I'll tell you, and what Mercer Waxman's going to tell you when we see the interview with her, this is actually a year-round process. This is not something that just starts now and ends in June. You have to check on things. You have to make predictions. You have to look at trends and things like that. So there are a lot of adjustments that get made over the course of this year, and a lot of different things that happen at different times of the year. But for our purposes here, let's talk a little bit about what's going to happen tomorrow and where we go from there. So early March, most years, the mayor makes the budget address, laying out priorities and highlighting new investments. All right. So the budget, the mayor goes before city council. And typically what happens, I always think this is interesting. Mayor goes up there, says a little bit, and then highlights kind of each council member and mentions something they're interested in. And then how they're working that into the budget. Maybe, a little bit of playing to the crowd, but, politicians do that, I guess. So that's what's going to be tomorrow. The mayor's going to get up there. He's going to talk a little bit about how all this stuff works, what he's looking to do, and then it's going to go from there. What happens after that is sort of where the scurrying starts to begin, because these budgets are huge and there's a lot of information within. When they would print these budget books, there would be usually 2 volumes that were about 1.5 to 2 feet tall each, because they were just so big. So between now and like early April, that's when everybody starts to figure out, okay, what's in the budget? What do I need to look at? Council members will typically say, listen, I'm going to look at specific things that I want to keep an eye on, and they really dive into that. This is where good staff work really becomes important too, because these things need a couple sets of eyes, and it's something we do too, where we look at it, and then we'll go to questions with various council members or other experts to say, what is this? What does this look like? So there's a lot that goes into that process. So it gives people about a month to look it over, and a month for us to look it over too. And we'll be telling you things about it as we get closer to those hearings, because we're going to get it tomorrow and have some more information about it next week and as we go on. So we'll be talking a lot about budget. And if you have questions or concerns or comments, send them to us and we'll address them on there. So then what happens after you have this kind of period, just to look at it, get an idea, budget hearings begin. And this is where every department comes before city council and answers questions about their budget requests. This is where things can get interesting, right? So you might have a department come in and council member asks them a question, and that department, and Denise can back me up on this, we've seen this a bunch of times, where that department's like, yeah, I don't know. I can't answer that question. And well, it's your budget hearing. You should know this.
Exactly. I mean, you are making this request for money, and you can't tell people what you did with the previous money that you had. That does not inspire confidence.
And that happens a lot. There was also one year, I will not name this department, where they were asked a question by a council member and they said, oh, we don't have our budget in front of us. And it's their budget hearing. And they didn't have the budget with them. And I still don't understand that. That was worse to me than some of the hot mic moments we've seen during budget hearings, where somebody thinks their mic is off and says something impolite, and then their microphone is actually on, which we saw last year. So we'll see what happens this year. Maybe we'll have a pool on that or something.
Hey, I never used my State of the Union people being rude bet. Maybe we can do that.
Maybe we should. Maybe we should have a bingo card or something. So you're going to have these hearings, and we're going to report on every single hearing. That's something we do. We've been doing it for years now, and we're going to do a lot with that this year. We're going to give you the breakdown of the hearing, what the key issues were. If you have questions, come to us with some of those questions, and we can ask them at the hearings or after the hearings, if there's something you want to know about, because a lot can come out in these hearings if the questions are done the right way and everything. So there's a lot that goes into this. So we want to hear from you. And then once we get through the hearings, the budget is passed like a piece of legislation. It's a budget bill that's voted on by council, has to go through 2 council hearings. And the last couple of years, these have come kind of down to the wire, because there'll be callbacks, they'll bring people back, they'll have discussions, they'll make adjustments, they'll put more money here, take money there. A lot can go into this budget, and my suspicion is we're going to have more money this year. It's going to be a bigger budget than we've had in previous years, and there's going to be more money in reserve. In some ways, you might think that when you have less money, there's more discussion about what to do with it. Well, we need to do this. We need to put it here. I am sorry about this program. We can't fully fund, things like that. I don't know, Denise. My thought is, with more money, there might be more discussion. It's not necessarily everyone is going to be satisfied. If there's a bigger chunk of money, they might want more of it for different, not pet programs, but things they care about. I don't know, though. We're going to see.
Well, that's kind of one of the things we touched on with Melissa Waxman. You have this pile of money that you got from the American Rescue Plan. And, it's going to be interesting to see what the state does with the $10 billion in American Rescue Plan money it has, because you've got to spend that money, and you've got to spend it by a certain time. And you would think that, you got $10 billion, you can kick some down to the part of the state that is basically the state's ATM. Because if you know how the state budget works, most of the money is coming from the 5-county Philadelphia area. And yet, whenever, particularly the Philadelphia part of the 5-county Philadelphia area, goes into Harrisburg and asks for anything, it's treated like a welfare recipient. And
And when you look at,
now, no, go
go
ahead.
ahead. Well, when you look at what we get back for every dollar we send to Harrisburg, it's maybe 75 cents.
Maybe.
Maybe. Yeah, it's probably less. So that was actually a good segue to our interview with city budget director, Marissa Waxman. All right, Marissa Waxman, Philadelphia City Budget Director. Thank you so much for joining us as always.
Oh, thank you for having me. Delighted to be here.
So before we get into questions about the upcoming budget process, could you tell us a little bit about your role and how that works in city government?
Sure. So I'm the city's budget director, and the city actually has a collection of different budgets, but the biggies are our general fund, which is operating all of our day-to-day services, trash pickup, police, things like that. And then our capital fund, which is where we invest in infrastructure. And together, that's about $8 billion a year for those two funds. The role that I play in my office and team is that we facilitate the process of developing a budget proposal each year, turning the mayor and council and community member input of priorities, turning.
All right, looks like we're having a technical difficulty here. So let's just give it a second. And we're being told we just need a minute to get this worked out. We'd always like to thank Marissa Waxman for joining us and walking us through what she does in the city, which is, I think, an incredibly challenging job because it's not just the numbers, which I have no understanding of. Oh, we might be back here. Are we good to go, Allison?
Things like that. And then our capital fund, which is where we invest in infrastructure. And together, that's about $8 billion a year for those two funds. The role that I play in my office and team is that we facilitate the process of developing a budget proposal each year, turning the mayor and council and community member input of priorities, turning that into nuts and bolts numbers and a piece of legislation. And then over the course of the year, we monitor to see how things are going, see if anything's out of alignment in terms of how much money is coming in or how we're spending it, and try and make sure that we monitor and sort of flag any problems, get us back on track whenever there's an issue.
Okay, now I imagine there are a lot of different ways to look at the budget. Can you tell us a little bit about your department's philosophy and how you look at it and how you put it together?
Certainly. So one of the things that Philadelphia cares a lot about is making sure we understand what bang are we getting for our buck? What do these dollars turn into in terms of programs or initiatives? So in our operating budget, the budget is broken down a couple different ways. First, by department. So we've got, a police department, a fire department, a finance department. And then within the department, there's two other ways we look at it with more fine details. One is looking at what we call programs. So like say within our streets department, we break it down into, there's a sort of a sanitation or a trash pickup program that's separate than the program for recycling. There's a program for street lights. There's a program for engineering. There's a program for the different types of work so that, we understand that we are spending this much to pick up trash and this much to repave roads. And then also the other way we look at it is what type of spending is it? And so we have one category that looks at our salaries and all of our personnel costs, our salaries, our benefits, things like that. For the city, that's about 2/3 of what we spend is on the salaries of city employees who are doing the work. The, healthcare workers in a health center, the procurement specialists, making sure the contracts go through. We also then, other categories we look at are how much we spend on goods, supplies, just paper and, anything we need to get the job done. There's big capital investments. That's when we need to buy a trash truck or build a building or repair a building. And we also look at how much we spend on things like debt service. That's another category. When we've borrowed money in the past, like a mortgage, we have to repay it. So we also break things out in the type of spending it is and cross-reference that with the program altogether. How much are we spending on salaries, on equipment for a discrete bundle of things like EMS service.
So what it sounds like, and from previous discussions, we've had, the budget process is a year-long kind of thing. It doesn't, even though it's kind of ramping up right now in preparation for the mayor's budget address, you're doing this all year. Where are you right now in that process?
So we're doing two things. We're actually always thinking about 3 budget years at the same time. So we're looking back to the fiscal year that most recently ended and making sure we really understand what happened. Sometimes payments come in late, sometimes payments go out late. And so we're just making sure that is all locked down and now is in the process of being audited, that we know exactly what happened in what we call fiscal year 22. Right now we're in fiscal year 23, and now we're doing that monitoring that I talked about, that, the budget was voted on last spring. Our fiscal year started July of this year. So we just released our quarterly city managers report last week, and that reported on the first half of fiscal year 23. And it tracks how are the revenues coming in compared to what we expected? How's the spending going compared to what we expected? And how are our departments performing? We keep in there performance measures. We track overtime, we track leave usage, and keep an eye on just the overall operations and fiscal condition of the city. So we just reported on the first half of FY23. And then the third budget year we're looking at is the future. And so, as you mentioned, next week is the mayor's budget address, and he'll be proposing his FY24 budget. And that'll be Mayor Kenny's 8th and final budget of his mayoral administration. And so that's where we're looking ahead. We've gathered information from community members, from departments, from community leaders, used all of that to develop a proposal for next year that the mayor will announce.
So it's probably still a little early, and I don't want to jump too far ahead, but very generally speaking, can you tell us a little bit about how remaining surplus money and American Recovery Plan funds could possibly be utilized in the upcoming budget?
Sure. So the American Rescue Plan gave Philadelphia $1.4 billion, which is a huge, wild amount of money. The challenge for us was, though, that because of the shutdowns and because of the economic impacts of the coronavirus, we lost more than $1.4 billion in expected revenues over time. Not all in one year, but we do a 5-year plan. And when we were projecting, we're like, it's actually going to be a more than $1.5 billion budget gap. So to even just keep doing what we normally did, we were sort of faced, if that money hadn't come in, massive layoffs or giant tax increases. And so what the American Rescue Plans do is let us avoid all of that bad stuff by filling the gap. But we don't fill it all in one year. The American Rescue Plan dollars were designed that we had a couple years to use them. They all have to be used by December 2024. And so what we're doing is we're still waiting for our revenues to catch up with where they would have been pre-pandemic. So we've been able to sustain our service delivery and even make some new investments, even though our collections, our revenues haven't recovered yet. And it's those American Rescue Plans, plan dollars that fill the gap. We call it revenue replacement. And so we can't isolate, I could tell you, and we're spending it all on just this one thing or just the other. But really, it's coming in as revenue. So everything that we've been able to sustain, every bad thing we've been able to avoid is because it came in and filled that gap. And so each year we're drawing down some of that money. So last year we used the first 250 million. This year we're using 335 million. Next year, 391 million. And then the last year, a bit over 400 million. So over 4 years, we're going to be using it. If we didn't string it out that way, if we had, just used it the first 1 year or 2 year, we'd hit a cliff. And then we'd be back in the same position of having to make really hard decisions. But by spreading it out over 4 years, our revenues from our taxes and other sources are recovering. They're growing back. And so hopefully by the time we get to that period in December 2024, we'll then be generating enough of our own revenue to sustain our services and not fall off that fiscal cliff.
Okay, I'd like to bring Denise Clay-Murray here on Philadelphia Home.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Waxman. You say that hopefully by December 2024, we'll have revenue collections that equal the money that we've gotten from the American Rescue Plan. But you have a lot of folks who are saying, this money, over $1 billion has come in, and was it really supposed to be used for, to fill in gaps, or was it supposed to be used to do things like, particularly in the city of Philadelphia, work on our poverty plan, work on our poverty issue? Can you speak a little bit to that, and for why we're using it to fill in gaps rather than deal with the poverty issue?
So I would say, and I really appreciate that question, because I know that a lot of people have questions about how this has worked. And I think that, if we didn't have this money, and it was 100% intended to be used for filling this when the legislation came out, it clearly has the provision to use it as revenue replacement. So we have no concerns about whether or not we're using it in accordance with how the federal government intended it to be used. So I think you're speaking more, though, to the choices we made, though, because it was pretty flexible. And for us, addressing poverty in Philadelphia really does require us to be able to sustain a lot of the services we have. We've been able to make investments to move us to get stable 5-day library service, and then move to starting to now get to 6-day service in some areas. We wouldn't have been able to do that. We probably would have been having those conversations we had during the 2008 recession about, do we need to close our libraries? We've also been able to continue to attack a lot of the underlying issues that drive poverty. For example, we've been able to dramatically increase our investments in education. Since the beginning of the Kenney administration, the city's annual commitment to the school district has grown by 171%. It's, over $250 million each year. Ensuring that we have education really does speak to poverty. And similarly, the investments we've made in community college, both by our basic contribution to them, but also introducing the Octavius Cato Scholarship Program, which is intended to really reduce racial disparities in graduation rates and time to graduation by providing not only tuition assistance, but all of the other supports that folks need: money for books, childcare, transportation. And so being able to sustain our, what folks think of as standard services that really do support Philadelphians, as well as increase and deepen some of our investments in foundational programs, not even, that isn't even getting to the pre-K, is trying to attack poverty in certain ways. And without these dollars, we really would be in a dramatically worse position than we are.
Now, the question I asked is based on conversations I've had with people in the community who see this pot of money, and they're like, okay, well, why can't we do this with it, or why can't we do that with it? Do you think that the reason why these questions are being asked is because folks don't quite understand what this was all about? And could the city have done a better job of explaining this to people?
I think you're absolutely right. I think that we have struggled, and we do have some materials out there that I'd be happy to share about like what this meant. Because one of the analogies we use is wit and wit out, like a cheesesteak. Like, with this money, here's all the things we've been able to do. Without it, we luckily didn't get to the point of having those conversations about large tax hikes and library closures and things like that. But you're absolutely right. We can do more. That's why I love opportunities like this to come out and talk to folks. We also have been trying to do more community engagement around the budget. So leading up to next week's mayoral budget proposal, we held numerous community engagement sessions with over 400 folks, community members, community organizations, business leaders, folks from nonprofits, cultural organizations, city frontline employees, to try, and we do two things. One is a bit of, pulling back the curtain on the whole budget process. And that includes conversations like, hey, what is the deal with that American Rescue Plan money? But also it creates an opportunity to hear from community members before the mayor's budget proposal gets put together to understand what community members are asking for. And so, a lot of what we heard is that folks are really concerned about violence, that's something that we really need to address. We need to continue to address homelessness and housing security, as well as education. And so, those are the things that as we're developing the budget going ahead and figuring out, with the American Rescue Plan dollars combined with every other dollar we have, how do we attach those to the things that community members are prioritizing?
Now, last year, you when you came and talked to us about the budget, you said that there was going to be an amount of the budget that the community was going to decide what it was going to be used for through a series of community budget hearings that you all were having. Are you going to do that this year? And is the money that the community is going to have a say on going to remain the same? Is it going to increase? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And unfortunately, that's one where we wound up hitting the pause button. What we learned as we worked with community members was that doing this on a full scale citywide basis didn't really make sense. That if we were getting votes and we put a playground in Juniata, what does that do for a family in Eastwick? And so we've taken a step back and really looked at how has this worked in other places. And usually it happens for smaller geographies. And so we've started to engage in conversations with some council members to see if we can retool this, because we didn't see it working as we worked with community members on the citywide scale. So unfortunately, there isn't a lot of progress for me to report there. I think it's something that we're not at a place where we know if or how that's going to proceed, because in talking to community folks, we realized we didn't want to move faster than the speed of trust, and we didn't want to put out anything that wasn't going to be successful. And doing it, in that way and pitting, swaths of the city against each other, we realized in talking to the community members was not going to be satisfying. And so we think it's important to really revisit that and not move ahead with it as initially envisioned.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I'm going to give you back to Larry McGlynn, and you're still listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5.
Hey, thank you, Denise. Marissa Waxman, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. I love coming here. Thanks so much for chatting with me about the budget.
All right, we'd like to thank Marissa Waxman for joining us. And it's good to hear a little bit about how that works. And I always thought she's very good at explaining it, I think. She does a good job of breaking things down and kind of letting us know what's going on. So we're grateful to have her come on. Denise, is there anything, before we move on, is there anything tomorrow that you're keeping an eye on or looking out for?
Well, there's one thing I'm kind of disappointed about. And I'm disappointed about the fact that the community-oriented budget thing didn't pan out as well as everyone had hoped, because that gave Philadelphians a sense of empowerment when it comes to a very large document that they don't often have as much of a say as they should in. I hope they revisit that, because that's, like I said, right now we have a city of people who don't necessarily feel empowered. And giving them a chunk of the budget to empower them would be a great idea. But I also have to agree with Ms. Waxman, you have to do it the right way, because if it ends up being something that only benefits one section of the city and not all sections of the city, then you've pretty much messed things up, and that's not good.
And this is what they call participatory budgeting. It's a concept that's been used in other places. And I remember when we spoke to Ms. Waxman about this last year, you and I were both pretty excited about it. We thought it was a really interesting idea. But one of the issues I think we had, and I'm going back a year now, is I think it was only $1 million.
Right. It was only like $1 million. And I was like, what is the entire city going to do with $1 million?
And my thought was maybe $100,000 in each council district, maybe. I didn't know, and they weren't sure either at that point.
Yeah.
And I think it got scuttled because they just weren't sure how to do it equitably. And I like you said, I kind of get that. I'm really glad you asked the question though, because I would love to see something like that maybe next year, right? Especially because you have this extra money.
Right.
But maybe you make it $10 million, and
because $10 million could really make a dent in the city
well, think about it.
for smaller projects that are too small to be considered as part of the regular budget. Because let's face it, the regular budget focuses on big stuff. It
Yeah.
focuses on streets. It focuses on the police department. It focuses on commerce. It focuses on really big stuff. So if you had a $10 million pile of money that you could give to city residents to decide what they wanted to do with, you could probably really make a dent and take care of some stuff that is almost always going to be left by the wayside when you look at the larger budget.
Well, and rebuild has not worked the way it was supposed to. A lot of those projects haven't gotten off the ground. So if you were to say to each council district, here's $1 million, tell us what project you want. That's one way you could do it. There's all kinds of different ways that could work and be useful. It could be safety, precautions. It could be cameras. We talk a lot about cameras. It seems like they're very expensive but some communities really want them. So there's all different kinds of ways that could work, and I hope it's something they do revisit in the future. And it's something we'll ask about. Definitely, what we could do? Maybe over the summer, we could have Ms. Waxman come back on so we talk a little bit about where they are in that process at that point in the year, and then bring up that question of, hey, are you going to do this again? So I think it's interesting. So Denise, we also had something expected, but still kind of a seismic shock. Council President Darrell Clark will be retiring at the end of this term. He will remain as council president through December into January, but he will not run for re-election. What were your initial thoughts on that, and what's going to happen?
Well, on the one hand, it was you could kind of tell. If you go to council as much as we go to council, you can follow body language. And Darrell Clark's body language was saying to me after 2020 with the pandemic and everything, his body language was kind of saying to me, I don't have to continue doing this. I'm 70 years old. I've accomplished a lot. This council has done quite a bit. My legacy is intact. And I don't have to keep doing this. So while it was surprising to some that he made the announcement last week, it wasn't surprising overall because you could kind of tell he had kind of had his fill of being city council president and being on city council. Now he probably has something else he wants to do more, and he's going to go get the chance to do that. Now, what that has inspired, unfortunately, for those of us who were hoping that we wouldn't have every part of everything politicized as we go into this election season, this has led to another branch of politicization, which is the who's going to be city council president next thing. Now, considering that we still have a primary election in May we have to go through, and a general election in November that we have to go through, I don't understand some of the jockeying that's going on right now. And I don't understand it because council could look completely and totally different when it gets sworn in January 2024. It could look completely and totally different. And it wouldn't matter how much jockeying you did to get the council president seat in the previous council if most of the people in the new council either don't know you, don't like you, or want somebody else in there. So I don't understand how don't understand the early politicization of this, but for some people have been waiting for this moment since Darryl Clark probably turned 69. So they've been gunning up for this for a little bit.
And you're absolutely right. Politically, one of the old axioms was you kept everything close.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't necessarily announce what you were going to do, just like Darryl Clark did. Darryl Clark waited past the last minute to tell people what was going to happen. Petitions were already out, and he still hadn't told anybody. Although the writing was on the wall, his former chief of staff resigned like a week before and started circulating petitions. That was a good sign that Council President Clark would not run for re-election, but he hadn't said it. So it's not really official until he tells us, no, I'm not going to do it. But you're right. Like, there's a lot of moving pieces. We're going to have a new mayor. We're going to have new council members. Council members who are elected who are in their first term will be senior members of city council in January. I was going through old newspaper articles going back pretty far. This hasn't happened in a really long time to have this much turnover in this amount of time.
And the thing is, the newer council members, and I think this is a part of the reason why Darryl Clark decided to leave now, the newer council members weren't necessarily as willing to just go along and get along as some of the older members were. Particularly in 2020, when it came to the budget, when it came to gun violence, you had some newer members of council who were like, I'm not going to vote for this budget the way that it's currently constructed. I want more money for gun violence prevention, and this is what you need to give me. That was something Darryl Clark was not used to because he hadn't had to deal with that for a long time. And I think that as council gets younger and more progressive, a word I actually hate, but I have to use it in this case, you're going to have some of the people who have been there for a while. It's going to, it's kind of going to be a little bit of a shock, because these are folks that are going to come in and say, well, I don't necessarily want this person as council president, or I don't necessarily want to do things this way, or I don't necessarily think that this is the best way to go. And you're going to have to deal with that, which is why, some of the people who have kind of said that they would, they are thinking about running for council president, most notably Majority Leader Curtis Jones, and we can get into that in a minute. Councilman Kenyatta Johnson is also somebody that's talking about running for the office. Cindy Bass, she's a district council person. She's also talking about running for the seat. And Mark Squilla, who's current first district council person. Now, the reason why I focused the most on Curtis Jones is because Curtis Jones has been the most obvious about it. Back when folks were speculating whether or not Darryl Clark was going to do this, he all but put his hat in the ring for the seat, saying, I'm going to run for city council president. And one thing that Philadelphia politics, and this is where a lot of the youngins get in trouble when they run for office, is that it is very much built on respect. And granted, some of these people do stuff that's just downright disrespectful and you feel like cussing them out anyway. But one thing there's a saying, for those of you who are viewers that have ever watched the television show The Wire, there was a character named Omar Little who was a who robbed drug dealers and also was not afraid of shooting people. And when someone came and tried to kill him, he basically he said, if you come for the king, you best not miss. And Curtis Jones has already missed once coming for the king, that is Darrell Clark. Part of the reason why he had lost some time as majority leader is because he decided one year, like it was his like second term, he decided he was going to run for city council president.
Yeah.
Darrell Clark squashed that. And not only did he squash it, he made it so he opened up the lane for Bobby Heenan to become majority leader. When Heenan had to step down due to his conviction, that would have been the perfect opportunity for Curtis Jones to reassume the seat. Sherelle Parker got it. And I'm sitting there as I'm reading the Philadelphia Inquirer and seeing that, Curtis Jones is saying, I'm going to throw my hat in the ring. I'm going to run for city council president. I'm like, dude, you didn't learn anything. And
Sure.
while Clark has said he is not going to endorse anybody, because when he became president, Marion Tasco, the former city council person, was running against him. And the fact that Michael Nutter endorsed her, he was mayor at the time, did more harm for her than good.
That's right.
So he says he's not endorsing anybody, but that does not mean he isn't going to be a part of the process. And I would rather have a Darrell Clark either deciding that he's not going to say anything or being on my side than having put myself in a position where he might just say, okay, I may not directly endorse somebody, but I'm going to back channel you right out of here.
Well, does it say anything that Jones eventually did become majority leader again? That maybe that hatchet's been buried and they're moving on.
I don't know if it's as much that the hatchet was buried as it was Kenyatta Johnson was on trial for corruption at the time. If you remember, Sherelle Parker was part of that first group of council people who resigned to run for mayor. And during that same time, Council Johnson, who the council president has a much better relationship with, was fighting for both his political life and his freedom. So I think that when Curtis Jones reassumed the job of majority leader, that played a big part in how he got it. But, it's a keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer situation. He's the majority leader now, and Darrell Clark does have to work with him in order to get things done. But don't be surprised if you notice a bit of friction when you announce 10 months before I even leave the office that you're coming for my seat. And the fact that you're doing it without taking into consideration that you're going to get a whole new council in 2024, that to me, I think everybody just needs to keep their powder dry until they take a look at the larger political landscape and see how it shakes out. Because let's face it, you might get a bunch of people who come into council and decide that they want to have an at-large council person as city council president for the first time in a very long time. They might decide, we want a Kendra Brooks, or we want like Catherine Gilmore Richardson, or we want we want an at-large council person to be council president. So don't be surprised if that happens.
I wouldn't be surprised at all if Catherine Gilmore Richardson is in leadership.
She's going to be in leadership
Eventually at some point, but I would say there's a really good chance in this upcoming term. Because she, even though she's only that'll be her second term, but she's a long history in council and really understands how it works very well.
Right. And I think sometimes people forget that a lot of the time, a lot of the people who have been the most successful as council people have been successful because they have been in that building for a while.
Yeah.
Catherine Gilmore Richardson has been in that building since she was in high school.
Yeah.
So, she knows the ins and outs and how to work the refs, for one of a better way to put it.
And her
Um,
mentor was Blondell Reynolds Brown.
right. And she
You can say the
really
same
knew
thing.
how to work the
Yeah.
refs.
Yeah. hmm
But
Absolutely.
but it's gonna be interesting to see, particularly with the new council. One, it'll be interesting to see just how new it actually is. And two, it'll be interesting to see how they weigh in on these things because even the people who are, trying to go into their second term in council, they may be kind of the old heads in this new in this new council, but they're all still relatively young. And they're going to want things that the older people that are in council may not, be prepared for.
Well, and that's why, if you asked me like a month ago, is Darrell Clark coming back?
Mhm.
I would have said yes, because you're going to have a new mayor, a lot of turnover on council, and a lot of the same issues we've been having.
Mhm.
So I don't, I thought, well, he might want to stick around. He's probably, and I can say with some degree of certainty, he's been asked by a lot of people to stay.
Mhm.
But you had said a couple of things that I think really make sense. He's been there 43 years in one capacity or another. It's a very long time.
Mhm.
He's been council president for 3 terms,
Mhm.
including these 2 terms in the Keddy administration, where, I mean, to be blunt about it, the best ideas that have happened in the last 4 or 5 years have come from city council.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm sure that that's debatable, but that's how I look at it. I think city council's been driving the agenda for the city, and have made some very good decisions and some questionable decisions about things. But ultimately, I could see when you get to the end of this term, you're looking at it and thinking, I've been shouldering more than what a traditional council president might be doing, because
Mhm.
there has been more of a void. And I could see why you might say, oh, I've had enough of this.
Yeah, I mean, the last relationship between a council president and a mayor that was even close to this was John Street and Ed Rendell.
Mhm.
And it was a lot more of a partnership
Yeah.
than what ultimately, because, let's be honest, Mayor Kenny and Darrell Clark did start out as a partnership a la Street and Rendell. But and everyone's talked about how in the second term, Jim Kenny hasn't been as active a mayor when it comes to certain things. You can kind of tell that he's ready to leave City Hall because he's another person who has been in City Hall a while. He was, in City Hall as an aide, and then he became a city councilman, and then he became the mayor. You can kind of tell that he's kind of done with it. But the thing is, he kind of took off a little too early. You still have another year of being mayor that you have to fulfill. And before that, you had 4 years. There were many times where I'm pretty sure that Darrell Clark wanted to ask Jim Kenny, if you didn't want to continue doing the job, why did you run again? And I'm sure no one knows that answer. And to be brutally honest, the people who were running against him were no great shakes either. Um, and that was probably one of the things that, pressed people to say, look, you should run for a second term because your alternatives kind of suck. But that probably pushed Daryl Clark a little closer to making a decision. Plus, like I said, he's 70. And when if you've been doing like different variations on one job for 43 years and you have a pension coming to you, and I'm pretty sure it's healthy, you want to be able to do things like go to the TGI Fridays in Cherry Hill and grab something to eat before you catch a movie at the AMC 24, or you want to travel more, or you want to do different things. And that's probably exactly what this is. It's not saying necessarily that Daryl Clark will retire, because let's face it, I'm sure there are everything from law firms to political consultant firms that are about to make him an offer he can't refuse as we speak, because that's also, that's a body of knowledge that you couldn't get anywhere else. But he's just at the point, and I can't say that I blame him, that he just doesn't want to do this anymore. He wants to pretty much say, if you thought that what I did was so easy, I'm going to let you take a shot at it.
Right. And I think, I don't think it's unreasonable at all to say, listen, I've done this for a long time.
Mhm.
And it's time, I'm 70 years old and I'm doing something else now. That's perfectly reasonable. And especially with a very challenging job
Oh yeah.
where it doesn't matter what you do, a lot of people are going to hate it and they're going to let you know about it. And I think that would be one of the hardest parts. One thing I did want to say, I've been thinking about it, and when you look at, and these are things we'll probably ask Council President about because we have 10 more months to do this. Highlights and things like that. One thing that stands out for me that I think was probably his greatest achievement, and I've been told he did a lot with to make this happen, was the $400 million neighborhood initiative, the neighborhood preservation initiative. Not only did that get done, but it got done during the pandemic when it was really hard to get, that you wouldn't think something like that could get moving. And, the council president, from what I've been told, put a lot into that to make that happen, and was able to work a lot of different things to get that done. That's, I think, is the thing I'll remember the most about his tenure, and maybe is his greatest accomplishment. And we'll talk more about that, because that's still something that's going on. That's still in process. It's $100 million a year. So that will still be going on after he is retired.
Yeah.
But I think that I always thought that I was impressed by that. I thought it was very impressive to be able to do that at that time. And it's one of the better things I'll remember about his tenure.
Well, one of the things that I'll remember is, we talk a lot about poverty on this show. And when we talk a lot about, what the city is doing about poverty. Before the pandemic, I remember a press conference that he had where he was talking about a poverty moonshot, where the city would actually put some time, effort, and most importantly, money into dealing with the poverty issues of the city. I'm hoping that over the next 10 months, we see what that could look like. And hopefully we'll get like a mayor and a council that will put it into motion, so that maybe the day comes a little closer to where we can stop saying that we are the poorest big city in America.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Denise, because one of the things that we've been really interested in is the poverty action plan. That was a pre-pandemic ideas. When the pandemic started, they couldn't do a lot of it because they just didn't know what they were going to have. And I've spoken to the council president about that, and he's very interested in bringing up some of those ideas again. And now's the time, right? Because it's budget season. So we have to leave it there. We want to thank everybody for joining us. We want to thank Marissa Waxman for being with us. Next week on the show, we'll have Larry Eichel from the Pew Charitable Trusts. We'll talk about post-pandemic recovery here in Philadelphia and what that looks like right now in relation to where it was last year and the year before. So we look forward to that, and we'll see you next week.